Man, we're working our way through the book of Luke now. We're still kind of calling it Encounters with Jesus, but if we're honest, we're just going through the book of Luke at this point. And chapter 17, we've flipped the page. I do want to kind of give you not a review of so much about what we've been doing, but kind of slow down and make sure we understand the context behind kind of what's going on. I think it's helpful to do that. I could really title this section that we're looking at here, the first 10 verses, spiritual detox. You could call it that. Every once in a while, there comes a place where you realize that you're not as healthy spiritually as you maybe thought, and you need to do a detox. Those of us who are kind of into our health, we do a detox a lot, right? And everybody's kind of like, I'm feeling like I've got the winter crud coming on, and so I'm going to start, doing this, right? Certain vitamins or certain IV drips or so whatever it is that you're into, right? And so we do that detox. This is Jesus detoxing spiritually leadership. This is what he's doing. And so I wanted to give us some context to this, because it seems like we always pit the Pharisees, and they are what we would consider the enemy of the cross in that sense. But to maybe kind of help you understand how they got where they got. And then there's also the disciples, who are, there's this move happening. We're seeing it real time in the Gospels. The old covenant is fading away and the new covenant is coming. And you've got the old guard, the Pharisees, who are on their way out, and you've got the disciples who will then be the carriers, right, of truth and of mentorship and of discipleship. And so they're going to be carrying that away. So what Jesus is determined to do here in this text is let them know, and he said it before, do everything they say, but don't act like they do, right? And so we know he's said those things. So basically, this is like he's calling out these guys and telling us, you and me, we're not going to be anything like that. And so this is where that transition is. Now, he's been doing it because this is what I call the Sermon on the Road, right? Because that's where it started. Remember, tons of people, big crowd. You had those who were just kind of there, the curious ones, right? Oh man, he did a miracle. What if he'll do another one? Let's follow him, see what's going on, right? They're kind of, it's like following the circus in that sense. And then you had the core that were like, man, we've been with Jesus. We've seen him do miracles. He sent 70 of them out to heal and to proclaim the truth, and they did that. Then he sent the 12 out, right? And so some of these are like, man, we're all in. This would be their core, I guess. And then you've got the Pharisees who are just trying to go, man, this guy's trouble. We need to lasso him, rein him in, box him in. If we have to, we're going to kill him. And that's where they've kind of come to the place. And we're gonna twist everything. We're gonna have our own propaganda. We're gonna say everything he does is of the devil, and don't be deceived, right? And so they're pushing that, so the whole crowd will rethink and not believe that he's the Messiah, because they've decided that he's not. And so you understand the context of everything going on. That's kind of what happens. And so Jesus is going to redefine what spiritual leadership looks like. Now we're going to find application for our own selves in this, but that's kind of what it is. But let me take you all the way back about 500-ish BC, right? And so if you don't know what's going on there, the exile is somewhat over. Ezra and Nehemiah kind of partnering together. They're building the wall. Ezra's bringing the spiritual truth. And so he reads the scriptures as they've all gathered back in Jerusalem, right? It's a powerful time for the nation because they've had years, both the north and the southern kingdoms, right, went into bondage. And now they're able to come back. And so they're beginning to move back into town. And so there's great weeping as the scriptures are read. They're in their homeland. There's a wall. They feel like, man, we're there, right? That's kind of what's going on. And then there was kind of a mantra that they would say, never again. That would be kind of it. Never again. Never again will we fall into idolatry. That's not happening to us. Like it's that cycle all over again, though, right? In the book of Judges, we're going to be good from now, we promise. And then God blesses them, and then they start thinking, we don't really need him. And I mean, sin's fun for a season, right? And they go right that whole cycle. So they're in the heat. They're in the top of this cycle now. Man, we're good. We're never gonna. I promise this time. I mean it. We're never gonna go into idolatry again. And so this is kind of where they are. And so you've got some scribes. They were still doing the thing. They were like Ezra had a scribe. Somebody was writing down what he had to say. All the prophets, they had scribes. They were doing, and then there was those who were teaching the Torah, even scattered, right? And so you had all of those. And so the scribes began to copy, teach, interpret all the truth that they could muster together, to collect together, so that by the time Jesus walks on the scene 400 years later, he speaks of the sacred scriptures like they're already a completed unit, and they are. Jesus, they had the Old Testament, everything that we have, all the way to Malachi. They had them in scrolls, and in the synagogues you would find them there, and they would pull one out. Remember, that's what they did to Jesus first time, right? He'd unfurl the book of Isaiah, find the place he wanted to preach, and he did so. And so that was going on. Some of these scribes became leaders, so to speak, what they would call Pharisees. The Hasidim is that word that's used. It literally means pious ones. And this came about 2nd AD, that range. So we're talking about a 400 year time frame as they morphed all of this stuff down into this. So we're talking about a long time that this has gone on. They were they rejected Greek culture because it had kind of flooded society. Like they were like, we're not. They could feel it coming, right? The Greek, all that influence was coming again. That's where you would get the term Hellenistic Jews, which are those who had embraced some of the Greek culture. You may remember that from some of your scripture readings. There was a time when the church was gathered together that they were handing out food to the widows, and the Hellenistic Jews felt like they were being second-classed and they weren't getting enough food, and so they were complaining. And that's when the apostles said, hey, man, we're going to keep ourselves devoted to scriptures and to prayer. Y'all choose 6 really good men full of the Spirit and let them figure that thing out, right? But that Hellenistic aspect is what that was. Now, so they were zealous, these Hasidim, so to speak, for the law, for purity, for separation, and for resistance. Makes sense, right? I mean, it makes sense, right? That's what you'd want to do. That's kind of what we sometimes feel like we're doing here. Hey, I'm going to uphold the scriptures. I'm going to make sure we're going to make sure we're pure, right? And we're going to separate ourselves from all the garbage of the world, and we're going to resist. Anytime they come in, I'm hitting them in the face, right? That's kind of how a lot of times you see today that goes on. Now, the Pharisees, that term Pharisee means separated one. And so they had separated themselves out. And so here now you begin to see what began to take place. They pushed against impurity. They wanted everything to be right and pure. They hated the Gentiles because they felt like they were the ones who were bringing all the mess in. You see this division that we see now in Jesus' day. That was kind of that's how it was birthed out of. It was a slow process that walked into this, what we would call Phariseeism. And so there was impurity. They were pushing against that. The Gentiles, they hated them. They didn't like sin. They were not going to compromise. And in an attempt to make sure that the law stayed true, they built fences around the law, right? So instead of the 10 commandments, they had like 360, right? And so you would take things like, hey, we're not going to violate the Sabbath. And just so we're clear, we're not even going to walk far from home. We're just going to camp out. And it was an interesting thing, though. They create all these laws about the Sabbath. You see that all through the scriptures, right? All through the scriptures, Jesus is like, you violated the Sabbath, you violated the Sabbath. And he's having to remind them, man, if your ox falls in a ditch, it's okay to get him out on the Sabbath, right? The scripture had rules for that. But they had a rule that you couldn't go so far from your home. I forgot how many steps it was. But to get around it, they would carry a rock from their home. And so when they got to that spot, however many steps it was away, they'd set the rock down. Now that was kind of like their remote house, and so then they could go further step. This is what the Pharisees were doing. So that's where that hypocrisy thing comes in, right? I mean, like, hey, we got rules. We're not going to violate the Sabbath. And they have these rules on top of rules, and they were just destroying everybody who was violating those rules and putting them under their thumb. And this is why this whole concept of the Pharisees is what it came to be. So they sought power because they felt that power would give them influence, and so they set themselves above. This is how it came. And I guess we've never really had that discussion before. The effect is a lot of spiritual pride. Hey, we're the keepers of the law. You should listen to us, right? And sometimes you can hear that from the pulpits if you're careful, right? Certain churches, you can hear that kind of a tone coming, like, we're superior to everybody else. And then there was a hatred for sinners, those who wouldn't play by the rules. And that's why, they look at Jesus like, he's eating with sinners. How can he, right? Because of this whole thing of how they came from. They were obsessed with ritual because in their mind, ritual was how you kept tradition and remember, they were all about that. And so this is what happened. And so there's this blindness that they have and this hypocrisy that they have. And so I said all that, I hope that wasn't a long rabbit trail for us, but it lets us understand that's what's going on. Now, that brings us to the conversation we're going to have today, because Jesus is now resetting, because they're the scene leaders of everything. And so he's now going to reshape that. He's training his disciples to create a different culture in the kingdom. So he says this in chapter 17, verse 1. Now he said to his disciples, the Pharisees are right there, right? We're still on that road thing, and they're still right there. And he says, now he said to his disciples, it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come. Stumbling blocks. Scandalon is the Greek word. That's where we get the word scandal, right? Scandal, we think scandal as some sort of a mess that it's a cover-up and all of those things. But scandalon to them was really a trigger trap. They would have a trap with a stick, right? And then you would get caught in there. And he says, so literally he's saying, now he said to his disciples, it is inevitable that spiritual traps, so to speak, would come. But woe to the one through whom they come. It is better for him if a millstone is hung around his neck and he is thrown into the sea than that he may cause one of these little ones to sin. So this is what's going on, and this is the first deal that we look at, and he's talking about this aspect of don't create stumbling blocks. Now, let me back up just real quickly and kind of remind us of the characteristics of the Pharisees. Was holiness, and so it was separation, not transformation. And this was one of the things they did. They did righteous acts, but they weren't doing them from the heart. They believed that the kingdom belonged to those who deserved it. These are some things, because these are the trigger traps, and I guess I want to make sure we're clear on what they're doing, right? So some of that is legal. It's separation for not to be holy, just for separation's sake. And so they weren't looking to be transformed. They thought they had already arrived. They were just preserving their good name. And they felt like that God owed them in some sense, because they were the carrier. And so God was blessing them. That's why they would have all the money and they would do all of those things and the power. And we're blessed by God. That's why when Jesus shows up, he says, blessed are the poor. Man, that rocked the Pharisees. Because their whole theology, their whole shtick was built on all of this garbage. And so when he says this statement, it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come. This is kind of what that is. And so it's like some of the things he's going to do is where they were mocking the believer. They were mocking all the new Christians. Everybody was good. They would mock them all, right? They would harass them. They would do all of those things. False teaching would be one of those things. Paul would bring it up, and he would say it's that aspect of eating meat sacrificed to idols, right? Like you and I have to be careful. So here's the point I want us to understand, and where he's shifting. Don't create stumbling blocks for new believers. Right now, if you go to Matthew 18, he says a very similar thing to this. In fact, he brings a child, has him sit and stand in the circle, right? And he says, whoever does this to one of these, and he says the same thing. Millstone, it's better, he said, that you'd have a millstone tied around your neck than that you would do that. And so this is that context of what it is. It's like what happens if we got. And Jameson runs around the house last night. He's our almost 2-year-old now, or a year and a half, whatever he is. He's walking now pretty good falling off his little tricycle or a little bike. But anyway, it would be like, what he's saying is, it's kind of like, he's just now learning how to walk, and just for fun, we put a stick there so he falls, right? That spiritually speaking, this is what Jesus is saying. That's a scandalon. That's a trap. You stuck something in front of them so they would fall. And so Jesus is saying, hey, stop doing that. Quit all these rules that you're remember how many times he would say, man, you're heaping all these rules. And you want everybody to know you keep mint and tithe and deal, but you don't even know what love's all about. Right? These are the things that he's saying there. And so sometimes this is that aspect of things that he's speaking of, that you and me shouldn't do as leaders, as servants, when I say leaders, we're all called to that leadership aspect of things, that we don't create stumbling blocks for people trying to come to the faith, right? And so we have to think about it, because they were doing that. It was like, oh, you want to do this? You got all these hoops you got to jump through. And so for you and me and for the disciples, it was not about that, right? They weren't. That's why Paul made it a big deal. Hey, listen, man, the whole sacrificial meat thing was the fact that it was still a carryover from the Greeks. They were eating meat and all that. Some of it had been sacrificed to the gods, and some of the church people were saying, well, we don't believe in that God, so that's like not a real deal to us. It's half price, so we're going to eat it. And Paul was like, look, man, there's some others over here, though. That's a big deal to them. How about you not do that for their sake? It wasn't necessarily sin to eat it, sin to not. Paul was basically saying that if I sit down and somebody provides meat, I'm going to eat it. But if they don't, I'm not going to beg for it. Like he's trying to explain this whole thing. And so for you and me, it's like, let's don't be an obstacle for people to come to Christ, right? Let's don't make it where you've got to do all these hoops, right? All these things, right? And the church, in somewhat, has pushed that way further than maybe it should be, but it's not a bad thing, right? Like it used to be, the excuse was this back in the old days. I'm telling how old I am now. Well, I don't have good clothes to wear. Well, now people are wearing pajamas in church, it feels like, and I'm like, not here, but it's like, let's we up our game a little bit. But it would be things like that, right? Or somebody would come in and their skirt was too short. Somebody's going to say something to them. Well, they don't know any better. Why are we? We've actually had that happen before in some churches, and so that's kind of why it's fresh. Like, that's the worst thing you could do to somebody who walks in church, is then start condemning them for that stuff. I mean, I was so mad when I heard that one day. And that lady never came back. All because we had somebody that thought it was okay to tell them that their skirt was too short. Like, what planet are you from? And so I didn't know Tammy's dad when he smoked, but I remember her saying that one of the kids, Robin, said, man, when I grow up, I'm going to be just like you and smoke. He put that cigarette out, and that's the last cigarette he ever had, right? Why? Because he understood this principle, right? I'm not going to be a scandalon to my kids. I'm not going to be a stumbling block. Now, smoking is not a sin. We understand that, but it's not healthy, right? Same thing with anything that, all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable, right? That's how Jesus says it. And so you and me should be careful that we're not doing the same thing the Pharisees were doing and creating all these rules and hoops. You got to jump through, and you got to do this, you got to do that. Like, what version of, we got to read out of this about. Man, I did a camp down in Georgia one year, and man, we were rocking it. And I was loving it. The kids were all excited. It was an amazing thing. And about 3 lessons in, I realized I'd been preaching out of the New American Standard, and they were a King James only camp. And I kept trying to figure out, why are these old people all mad at me? But the kids are like, yeah. And so I'm like, man, why would you do that? Why would you say it's King James only? And some of us grew up where that was kind of the thing. And so what I want us to hear from this, because this is what Jesus is trying to say, don't create those opportunities to cause people to stumble and lose their faith in God. Sometimes it is false teaching. There is a teaching, and that you have the ability to command healing, and it's yours, and you have it. You have enough faith it'll happen, and all that. You know how many lives that I've dealt with that have been shipwrecked because they bought into that, and then God didn't do that, and now they don't buy into God at all because of that. Well, that's not because God failed. That's because people put a scandalon in the path and preach something that the scriptures don't preach, and that's the fallacy of it. And so we have to be careful what we say. This is what Jesus is telling his disciples, right? Hey, listen, those guys, they love to create obstacles, that you have to jump through. So you can be like them, and they're going to keep putting them in front of you. So you're never like them. You and me aren't going to be like that. This is the call. This is what he's saying. Hey, don't create those stumbling blocks. And the second thing he says in verse 3, be on your guard, brothers. If your brother sins, rebuke him, and if he repents, forgive him. And if he sins against you 7 times a day and returns to you 7 times saying, I repent, you shall forgive, right? So what's he saying here? Hey, you're going to always have a forgiving heart. We're going to have that. Now, there's 2 things he's going to tell us to do here, and we're going to look at it. But so just so we're clear on the points, right? The first one is, hey, don't create a bunch of obstacles for people to come to Christ. Don't start making, well, you got to do this, you got to do that, and you got to get, no, just look, it's about believing and confessing. So don't make it any harder than that. And let's don't say they got to clean themselves up before they get there and all that kind of stuff. And the second one is, and you always have a forgiving heart. Listen to what he says. It's strong what he says. Be on your guard, right? Be on your guard. If your brother sins, it's okay to rebuke them, right? It's okay to go, hey, man, what you're doing is wrong, right? But then when they go, hey, you're right, I have a responsibility to forgive them. If it's 7 times, remember when Jesus told Peter, well, how? It came out of the same kind of context. Well, how many times, Lord? 7 times 70. That blew their mind. Because at some point you go, no, you don't deserve it, which is what the Pharisees thought. You don't deserve forgiveness, right? You're sinners, you're scum. We're not invited to the house. You're not invited to the synagogue. You can't come. You're just out. And he's saying to you and me, hey, don't do that. It's okay to hold people accountable, right? This same parallel passage like Matthew 18. Remember what he says there? Because it's the same context. I'm not going to take you there. I'll just quote it for you. If your neighbor sins against you, go to him in private and let him know what was right and what was wrong. If he listens, great. You've won your brother. You know what you're supposed to do? Forgive him. If he doesn't, get a couple of witnesses. Because maybe you're not seeing as clearly as you think you are. I love this aspect of things. And so you bring 2 or 3 witnesses together, and they may go, no, Pardue, you're wrong. And Michael's right. But they may go, yeah, hey, Michael, maybe you so now at some point, there's going to be some sort of resolution, right? Either they're both going to go, hey, that we agree with Randy, man, you should straighten that up. Or they're going to say, hey, Randy, you probably ought to back off. You ought not put a stumbling block because he didn't do anything wrong, right? This is what's going on. And so that's what happens in Matthew 18. And then he says, look, and if they still don't listen at that point, you're going to tell the whole church, right? And so there's a process where when people do things wrong, how we handle it. But his point here is, it is always, though, to not hold grudges and have a forgiving heart. And this is powerful to me. Galatians 6 says it like this. If you see your brother trapped, same word, scandalon. If you see your brother trapped in a sin, right? Y'all ever been, maybe I'm the only one who's ever been trapped in a sin. Y'all ever been trapped in sin before? And sometimes you don't even know it and you glory in it and it's my freedom. And then you realize, no, it's sin, right? But you're walking down the road of life and you see a brother in sin. We have an obligation to help him, right? So we do that part. But then we're quick to forgive. Here's what he says. If you see your brother trapped in a sin, Galatians 6, you who are spiritual, that doesn't mean you who are Pharisee, it means you who are walking, actively loving the Lord, right? Spiritual, restore such a one. In a spirit of gentleness. Looking to yourself, be careful, don't start thinking you're prideful, or you're going to fall too. This is exactly how Paul says it. He gets it from this passage right here. This is where it comes from. So out of this, we learn 2 things out of this second point. We don't lead people into sin, but we surely lead people out of sin, right? And we forgive coming and going. That's the point. That's what he says. And the disciples understood that because in verse 5, the apostles said to the Lord, you're going to need to increase our faith. because that makes no sense, right? And so this is the third point, and it's this, that you and the Pharisees thought they had already arrived, right? They had all the faith they needed. They were there. He's telling the disciples, never think you've arrived. Always have faith like a mustard seed. So we're going to talk about that because that's what he says next. Let's read it. The apostles said to the Lord, increase our faith. But the Lord said, if you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and be planted in the sea, and it would obey you. Now, he's used this phrase several times, right? Mustard seed. He's used it in several. One of the times he said it, he speak to the mountain, which we looked at one of the first songs we sang, right? Speak to the mountain. Here, obviously, there's no mountain. There's a mulberry bush, though, which is a strong bush, had a lot of roots. Well, that's a whole other story. And he was saying that you could tell it to be moved, and it would move. His point isn't, we tend to think it's have to have a little bit of faith. He's not talking about having a little bit of faith. He's talking about having a growing faith. That was what the mustard seed was. So when somebody says, all you have to have is just the faith of a mustard seed, doesn't mean just a little faith. It means that you have to have that faith, and it ought to be growing, because a mustard seed will grow, right? We looked at that a few weeks ago, right? That's the nature of the kingdom. It's just going to grow. And so this is what he's saying. Mustard seed is that having that faith that's growing. It's humility that grows our faith. Pride never grows anything. Have you noticed that? Just arrogance. That's all it grows. We grow when we realize that I was wrong. I hate that term, don't you? Wrong. But it's in humility. It's when we've been brought to our knees that we look up, and that's when we believe that God don't help ain't coming. That's faith, right? The Pharisees never believed that. They believed they were always walking in righteousness. They were always right. Everybody else was beneath them. This was the whole point. And so he's saying here, look, they think they've already arrived. You, on the other hand, leaders of the new kingdom are going to believe that we're going to grow in that faith, and that humility is the way to make that happen. Their pride stood in their way in that whole process. Then he gets to the last section. He tells a story, and it's kind of interesting. He says, this is the fourth point. Now, which of you, having a slave plowing or tending his sheep, will say to him after he comes in from the field, come immediately and recline at the table and eat? So you got a servant. So what are you paying for? You know, he's working off his debt. Slavery in that day was kind of that deal, right? They owed the guy, they couldn't pay it, so you're going to work it off. Indentured servants, in a sense. And so the guy worked, and he comes in. You don't go, hey, celebrate. No. His job was to work. You don't celebrate a guy for doing what he was supposed to do. And this is the point of the story. You don't go, hey, come on in, man, recline at the table and eat. On the contrary, will he not say to him, hey, prepare something for me to eat and properly clothe yourself? Like, go freshen up. I don't want the smell of your odor. Like, go clean yourself up, fix me something to eat. You're still paying off the debt. This is the point. Clothe yourself and serve me while I eat and drink. And afterward, you may eat and drink. He does not thank the slave because he did the things which were commanded, does he? So you too, when you do all the things which were commanded you, say, we are unworthy slaves. We have only done what we ought to have done. Now, let me help us make sense of that a little bit, because it does sound like, well, why would you not want to give the guy a break or whatever, right? This is because the Pharisees were living this way. God's blessed me because I earned it, right? I'm not a slave. I have gone over and above, and the Lord's blessing me and all of that. And so that pride caused him to feel like they should be honored. That's why they loved the chief seats. All of that stuff makes sense when you start looking at this here. Everything they did, Jesus says, was to be seen by men, right? They would fast, and they wanted you to know it. So they didn't wear all their fancy garb that day, and they didn't clean their face. They wanted you to think, oh, he's so holy, he's fasting, look, he's just, right? He wanted to be seen by men. Or he stands in the street beating his breast. I thank God like I'm not like these other men. I fast, so many days, and I pray, right? It's that whole thing of deserving honor. And that's why Jesus said, hey, don't go sit over there like you own that seat. Because then when a guy comes in who actually does, you're going to get kicked out and you're going to look silly when you have to go all the way back to the other table. And so the whole point here is that you and me as leaders, it's about, we're just going to be obedient because it's the right thing to do. And I'm not expecting honor. I'm not expecting that. It's the right thing to do. I'm not looking for the choice seat. I'm not looking to be recognized by men. This is crazy because he's basically just slammed the Pharisees and told the disciples it's a new day. This is what spiritual detox looks like. And so let me just kind of give them to you quickly and then we're done. Point one was, hey, let's don't create stumbling blocks, right? Let's don't make it hard for people to come to the kingdom in the sense of we're going to create these rules. Just don't do that. Let's lead people. Don't lead people into sin, and let's make sure we're leading them out, and let's be forgiving in that whole process. Forgiveness is powerful. You know what it feels like. I want to be around people who give me grace and who once I've confessed some things, go, hey, let's forget about that. I don't want to know that you've got a little scorecard and you're keeping it and it's in your back pocket. So if I ever mess up again or I start to say something to you you don't like, you're going to pull it out and start slamming me. That's not who we are. And the third thing is we're going to be people who are always growing in our faith. We're going to be trusting God more and more with more and more, right? There's something powerful that happens when we do that. And the last thing is, and it's never going to be about me. It's always about the King. That's the message that flows out of those 10 verses, man. I'm glad we had an opportunity to look at that. And we're going to sing the song that we've been singing now almost every week. I'm just moving it around in different places, but it's the same song. And so we're going to sing our way out with this one.